Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. This is part two, and just piggybacking part one. I was just talking about Dr. Martin Luther King and how he stated his belief of his belief that Israel had the right to exist, and how I shared and explained that I personally felt that as intelligent and extremely bright Dr. King was, I did not believe he really investigated further into this matter, or investigated to the point that he was able to study the side of the Palestinian people as to where they were coming from and what they were facing. And I personally believe had King looked at that and investigated that, eventually I felt that King would have eventually switched sides with the Palestinians. But unfortunately, his life was taken early in life at the age of 39 over, out on the balcony in front of his hotel room over at the Lorraine Hotel in Memphis, Tennessee. That was on April 4th, 1968. But I personally felt had he not been killed, he would have stood on the side of Palestine. I think he would have switched with the Palestinians. I don't think he would have stayed in alliance with Israel like he did. Now let's get to El Hajj Malik El Shabazz, or Malcolm X. I certainly want to dedicate this part to him. Now, he had an article while he was in Egypt. This is in the Egyptian Gazette. This was on September 17th, 1964. And this website, this group called the Socialist Viewpoint, and this is in the website is on www.marxist.org. And again, the name of their newsletter is called Socialist Viewpoint. Now, just to let you know, I do not subscribe to Marxism, socialism, or communism, or anything like that. But I just so happened to come across Malcolm's article on this particular website. Now, the date here that took place, September 17th, 1964, this particular article is important because Malcolm, by this point, went through a religious change. So, like I said, the first 12 years, he was a minister in the Nation of Islam, right? And he made some unwise choices. First of all, the Nation of Islam commanded the ministers not to say anything about the assassination of John F. Kennedy. All ministers and all members were ordered to not say anything about it. And if anyone was to question them about it, they were to say no comment. And Malcolm didn't listen. He rumbled with it and said the chickens were coming home to roost. So he was totally wrong on that. And the Supreme Minister, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, Rahimullah, he rightfully silenced him. Now, I know some of you are saying, why do you say Rahimullah and refer and call Elijah Muhammad the Honorable Elijah Muhammad? Did he call himself the messenger? Did he commit shirk? He did do those things. But then, before he died, before Honorable Elijah Muhammad died in 1975, his own son, the late Imam W.D. Muhammad Rahimullah, before his father died, he actually gave him Shahada. he gave his father Shahada before he died. So all those things that his father taught about Farad and about himself, when he took Shahada, that, in other words, he denounced, just by doing that, he denounced those things that he had preached for 40 some years. So that was according to Imam W. Muhammad, that, his father and his mother, Sister Clara Muhammad, may Allah be pleased, may Allah have mercy on her. They both took Shahada before they died. So according to Imam Muhammad, his father, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, died as a true Muslim, died being a member of part of the Sunnah. Inshallah, Allah will grant him Jannah. Now, but anyway, Malcolm took Shahada while he was in New York at the Islamic Center, and went on Hajj. And his sister Ella Collins, rahimullah, she actually took Shahada before Malcolm did. So I'm sure she played a role in convincing him as well as a group of other people. And so by this time, he had already embraced Islam in the correct way. He also completed the Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca, which we are to do as Muslims at least once in our lifetime, and that's the fifth pillar in our faith in Islam. So let me go ahead and read to you this article called The Zionist Logic. It says here, the Zionist armies that now occupy Palestine claim their ancient Jewish prophets predicted that in the last day, quote unquote, last days of this world, their own God would raise them up, a quote unquote Messiah who would lead them to their promised land. And they would set up their own quote unquote divine government in this newly gained land. This quote unquote divine government would enable them to quote unquote rule all the other nations with a rod iron. If the Israeli Zionists believe their present occupation of Arab Palestine is the fulfillment of predictions made by their Jewish prophets, then they also religiously believe that Israel must fulfill its divine mission to rule all other nations with a rod of irons, which only means a different form of iron-like rule, more firmly entrenched even than that of the former European colonial powers. These Israeli Zionists believe their Jewish God has chosen to replace the outdated European colonialism with a new form of colonialism, so well disguised that it would enable them to deceive the African masses into submitting willingly to their divine authority and guidance, without the African masses being aware that they are still colonized. The Israeli Zionists are convinced that they have successfully camouflaged their new kind of colonialism. Their colonialism appears to be more benevolent, more quote unquote philanthropic, a system with which they rule simply by getting their potential victims to accept their friendly offers of economic aid and other tempting gifts that they dangle in front of the newly independent African nations, whose economies are experiencing great difficulties. During the 19th century, when the masses here in Africa were largely illiterate, it was easy for European imperialists to rule them with a quote-unquote force and fear. But in this present era of enlightenment, the African masses are awakening, and it is impossible to hold them in check now with the antiquated methods of the 19th century. The imperialists, therefore, have been compelled to devise new methods Since they can no longer force or frighten the masses into submission, they must devise modern methods that would enable them to maneuver the African masses into willing submission. The modern 20th century weapon of neo imperialism is dollarism. The Zionists have mastered the science of dollarism, the ability to come posing as a friend and benefactor, bearing gifts and all other forms of economic aid and offers of technical assistance. Thus, the power and influence of Zionist Israel in many of the newly independent African nations has fast become even more unshakable than that of the 18th century European colonialists. And this new kind of Zionist colonialism differs only in form and method, but never in motive or objective. At the close of the 19th century, when European imperialists wisely foresaw that the awakening masses of Africa would not submit to their old method of ruling through force and fears, these ever scheming imperialists had to create a new weapon and to find a new base for that weapon. The number one weapon of 20th century imperialism is Zionist dollarism. And one of the main bases for this weapon is Zionist Israel. The ever scheming European imperialists wisely placed Israel where she could geographically divide the Arab world, infiltrate, and sow the seed of dissension among African leaders, and also divide the Africans against the Asians. Zionist Israel's occupation of Arab Palestine has forced the Arab world to waste billions of precious dollars on armaments, making it impossible for these newly independent Arab nations to concentrate on strengthening the economies of their countries and elevate the living standard of their people. And the continued low standard of living in the Arab world has been skillfully used by the Zionist propagandists to make it appear to the Africans that the Arab leaders are not intellectually or technically qualified to lift the living standard of their people, thus indirectly inducing Africans to turn away from the Arabs and towards the Israelis for teachers and technical assistance. And Malcolm uses the saying, quote unquote, they cripple the bird's wing and then condemn it for not flying as fast as they. The imperialists always make themselves look good, but it is only because they are competing against economically crippled, newly independent countries whose economies are actually crippled by the Zionist capitalist conspiracy. They can't stand against fair competition. Thus, they dread Gamal Abdel Nasser's call for Arab unity under socialism. In case you don't know, Gamal Abdel Nasser at the time was the president of Egypt, and he was definitely a favorite among anti-imperialists, and for his program in uniting Africa, the Middle East, and Asia together. So Malcolm goes on. If the religious claim of Zionists is true, that they were to be led to the promised land by their Messiah, and Israel's present occupation of Arab Palestine is the fulfillment of that prophecy, where is their Messiah whom their prophet said would get the credit for leading them there? Let me stop here. I'm going to continue with this in part 3.